when we look at what was and wasn't canonized as part of our TaNaKh, the criteria is nivuah, prophecy that's relevant for every generation. If it's prophecy but only relevant for its own generation, it doesn't get into TaNaKh. And it has to be prophecy that's relevant always, that has a message for us always. Okay? So some things didn't make it in. But one thing we see when we look at TaNaKh, especially when we look at our first three kings, Shaul, David, and Shlomo, we look at the development of Israeli society today. We look at the map of our redemption process today. We can say that Shaul represents Zionism. Okay? Shaul is a Zionist in terms of how we should understand it today. The people want a king to make us like all other nations, right? And Shaul does that. Shaul is focused on the security of the people of Israel, our defense, our economy, our unity, right? These are all very important to him, like Zionism. And he builds the vessel, he builds the kingdom, right? He takes this kind of federation or confederation of tribal identities, right? The Israelite tribes, and he merges them into an Israeli kingdom. And this is a kingdom that's very focused on our material well-being, our security, our economy, our unity. But it's not really focused on spiritual goals. Meaning, even when the Plishtim return the Aron HaBrit, the Ark of the Covenant, it's kind of left in Kiryat Yearim. Shaul doesn't know what to do with this. Now, it's important to Shaul that his kingdom be recognized as a Jewish kingdom, as an Israelite kingdom, as a kingdom that has a stamp of approval from the Navi Shmuel, from the prophet Shmuel. But he's not looking for prophetic ideas or spiritual goals to animate the policies of his kingdom. Okay, that's Shaul, that's Zionism. That is Zionism. Zionism seeks a Jewish state that's recognized and accepted as a Jewish state, that's really focused on the material well-being of the Jewish people, right? Our economic success, our security, our unity, that's Zionism, and that's great. David is the next stage. David is really focused on the spiritual identity of this kingdom and on what the values are that drive it, that animate it. And David is very much focused on the connection between the nation of Israel and the Creator. He very much wants to build the Beit HaMikdash. He brings the Aron HaBrit, to Jerusalem, but he can't build the temple. He wants to, but he can't. He's like the national religious today. Those who serve as combat officers with distinction, right? Some of our greatest warriors today are coming from the national religious sector, coming out of schools like Eli and Atzmona, etc., right? Like Mechinot that produce these kind of super soldiers that even the army and the defense ministry recognize as being our best combat officers. And they're ideologically driven in the same way that we can say Hamas or Hezbollah are ideologically driven, right? Maybe a different ideology, but they're driven, and that's what makes them such great soldiers. If you talk to somebody learning at Eli, preparing for the army, and ask him what kind of training did you do today, right? How many push-ups? How many kilometers did you run, right? How many pull-ups? He'll say, oh, I have to do that on my own time. We're learning Torah. That's what they're doing. They're learning Torah. They're learning they're receiving the ideological fuel that will make them great soldiers. Right? It's not physical training. Physical training they're responsible for on their own. They're treated as adults. So that's David. David is very focused on the spiritual identity, wants prophetic ideas to animate the Hebrew kingdom and is willing to fight the wars and has a lot of Mesirat Nefesh and makes the nation strong and makes our enemies fear us, but cannot achieve its spiritual goals, cannot achieve its ideological goals, cannot build the temple. Shlomo is the third stage. Okay? Shlomo is standing on the shoulders of David, just as David is standing on the shoulders of Shaul. Meaning, what David contributed to this development was only possible because Shaul first built the vessel, built the kingdom, right? David inherits that kingdom and fills it with spiritual content. And then Shlomo takes the vessel that Shaul built and the spiritual content that David added and the territories that David won in battle and the fear that David struck into the hearts of our enemies, right? Shlomo inherits that kingdom. And Shlomo, unlike Shaul and David, are not really focused, he's not really focused on Israel at all. He's focused on humanity. Shlomo is focused on what this nation has to give to humanity. And what's our historic role in relation to the rest of humanity? How are we going to bring humankind close to Hashem, close to the Creator? That's Shlomo's function. He's facing outward. And Shlomo can build the Beit HaMikdash, because that's the purpose. That's the purpose of Israel, to be a Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. But to who? Right? If we are meant to be a Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of Kohanim, who are we meant to be Kohanim to? Kohanim are servants, right? Like Israel is to humanity what the Kohanim within Israel are to Israel. The Kohanim are responsible for the spiritual connection between the nation and the Creator. So Israel is responsible for the spiritual connection between humanity and the Creator. And that's something that Shlomo was very connected to. And that's why Shlomo is able to build the Mikdash. Okay? David can't do it no matter how much he wants. And you can see it today if you look at Israeli society today. Right? You see, first of all, the big fight over the trajectory of our country, over what this nation is going to be, is between Shaul and David. Right? Like if we look at the judicial reform episode, those who are fighting against the legislation, trying to defend the Supreme Court, it's Shaul trying to protect itself, because Shaul knows that the Supreme Court today is really the last line of defense before David takes over. David has the numbers. David had the kids. That's the sector of Israeli society that has grown not only demographically, but also in terms of their ideological vision. Develop something, is committed to certain values that a lot of the Shaul people kind of, Zionism in many ways ran out of fuel, right? The kids and grandkids raised on Zionist values are not really so Zionist anymore, or not in an active way, in a passive way. We can say that Zionism today means Israeli patriotism and support for the state of Israel among diaspora Jews. That's basically what Zionism means today. It's not really an ideology or a political goal that somebody is trying to actualize, right? It's been actualized. Zionism did it. It's in the past. The achievements happened, and now we support them. Now we like them. Now we want to defend them. That's what it means to be a Zionist. That's Shaul. Shaul is scared of David. Because when Shaul sees David, Shaul sees a Jewish Iran. Like, what are we going to have, a theocracy here? Shaul likes to have some Jewishness, right? Shaul wants Shmuel to publicly endorse his kingship, his rule. But he's not looking for this to be some messianic theocracy. And he perceives David as wanting a messianic theocracy. So David is like the second step, and we see that there's this tension in Israeli society as a shift is taking place, where David is becoming stronger and Shaul is becoming weaker. Now, we shouldn't kid ourselves. Shaul still controls most of the wealth in the country, security forces, certainly at the top, the Supreme Court, obviously, the media, academia, the relationship with diaspora Jewry, right? Even the Hasbara organizations, when you see the pro-Israel organizations in the diaspora that promote Israel, that defend Israel, they're defending Shaul. They're not defending David. They're not trying to market Israel as a David kind of place. They're marketing it as a Shaul kind of place. A nation like other nations, which means Western, right? Like a westernized Israel that is a great nation state. What David appears to want is scary. And who's Prime Minister Netanyahu in this metaphor? He's Yehonatan ben Shaul. What's wrong with Netanyahu? Why does Shaul hate Netanyahu? Because Netanyahu is empowering David. Right? Netanyahu is actually including those forces in his government. He's not them. Netanyahu himself is not David, he's Shaul. But he's a leader from Shaul who legitimizes David. And they're not supposed to be legitimized. He includes them in his cabinet. Right? He basically says these are good people. I like their values. They're legitimate partners. So because Netanyahu does that, it causes the majority of Shaul to see him as a traitor. Right? He's basically facilitating this process of a handover. He might be the last leader of Shaul that we have. The next leader might be more David. But it's important for us to know that as the society shifts from Shaul to David, the people who've already been David need to start thinking like Shlomo. We need to begin the shift towards Shlomo. And ultimately, only when we start to think in Shlomo terms can we alleviate the fears of Shaul. What causes Shaul to fear David is real. Right? We're talking about highly motivated, ideologically motivated Jews who are committed to a very TaNaKh identity. Right? We can say that if Shaul of the Zionists, and remember, Zionism should essentially be understood as a Jewish flavor of European nationalism. And European nationalism was very much inspired by the Israelites of the biblical age. So we can say that Shaul has a copy of a copy. Their national consciousness is a Jewish version of a European thing that was inspired by our ancestors, the ancient Israelites. David wants to go right back to the source. David just has a national consciousness that's like our ancestors, what the Europeans copied. And that's part of the tension in Israeli society between those who are happy with the copy of the copy and feel safe with that, right? Like a Jewish flavor of European nationalism. Whereas the national consciousness that is developing in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, among very ideologically motivated Jews, is a national consciousness that's more like what the Europeans copied. Right? So the problem is that Shaul sees David as dangerous, as too much like our neighbors, as out of touch with the world, the civilized world, the Western world, right? That's how Shaul would see it. And David kind of sees Shaul as having an inferiority complex and weakness. And we need like a real Jewish state, not just like Jewish decorations on a Western-style nation state, but a real Jewish state, a deep Jewish state. And a lot of the points of tension between Shaul and David come down to basically how they see these like social and political issues that often arise. So when Shaul looks at these issues, he might say, "Well, what does what's politically correct in the world today, especially according to the dominant civilizations, right? What is considered the moral and ethical and correct thing to do according to the dominant civilization of today?" That's how Shaul might look at a specific issue, whereas David might look at the same issue and say, what would our ancestors have done? What would the heroes of TaNaKh do in this situation? Right? So often when it comes to some of the hot button issues of today, you can see that Shaul would relate to David as just out of touch and backwards. And David would relate to Shaul as not being rooted enough in our identity and having an inferiority complex when it comes to the West. Now, if David, instead of just rejecting the liberal Western answers to many of today's deeply contested social and political issues, if David wouldn't just reject the liberal Western answers, but would actually present authentic Hebrew answers that can compete with the liberal Western answers on their own ideological turf, then maybe Shaul would say, wait a minute, David might have something here. David actually cares about these issues and wants to find a solution and isn't just rejecting. Right? That's important. And that's part of what gets us to Shlomo. Even thinking about these questions, even thinking about the concerns of humanity, the real needs of humanity in our generation, in our chapter of history, in a thoughtful way, in a deep way, in a sensitive way, in an empathetic way, and to then see if we can formulate real Hebrew answers coming from our ideological paradigm, coming from our values, but answers that seek to address the needs of real people having real problems, real challenges, and answers able to compete with the liberal Western answers. The attempt to do it, even if it's not successful at first, but the very attempt to engage in that conversation already begins a transition from David to Shlomo, and already shows the Shaul people that we might not be as bad as they thought. Right? We're not just rejecting. And by the way, if you look at the last thing that David does, the last political act of David that were shown at the end of Shmuel Bet, before the transition to Shlomo, you could see, what does David do? He acknowledges and tries to correct the crimes of Shaul against the non-Jews in our land, the Givonim. Right? David, the ideologically motivated Jewish nationalists in the West Bank, should confront the Nakba in order to become Shlomo. Right? Shaul can't confront the Nakba. What happens when somebody from Shaul confronts the Nakba? They confront the Palestinian story. What happens? They lose their national identity, their national consciousness, their connection to Israel. Right? Because their roots aren't deep enough. But David, with his deep roots and his deep aspirations to build the Beit HaMikdash, his commitment to every inch of Eretz Israel and Torah Israel, he can confront the Palestinian story and become Shlomo. And remember, when we look at the transitions of power, Shaul vehemently opposes David's rule, the idea that David will be king. And he pursues him, right? Just like the media and sometimes our security forces pursue the David camp today. Right? There's a little bit of, the volume goes up and down on it, but there's a little bit of a war on David in the Shaul sector. Shaul sees David as a threat in a different way than it might see Hamas as a threat or Iran as a threat. But David is perceived as a threat. And therefore, some of the resources that are meant to defend against and neutralize threats to the state of Israel are directed towards subduing David. In fact, when Yisrael Katz became the defense minister recently, he replaced Gallant as defense minister. One thing Yisrael Katz did was he freed all the Jewish political prisoners who were in administrative detention. They were David people, right? So Shaul is very much opposed to the transition to David, very scared of it, very threatened by it, and even devotes resources to fighting it, to trying to stop it. David is reluctant about the transition to Shlomo, meaning David does not appoint Shlomo his successor officially until Natan and Bathsheba push him to. Right? Until there's a question of Adoniyahu saying that it should be him. Right? Until there are other ideas that are put out there that maybe it won't be Shlomo. David accepts in theory that it's going to be Shlomo, but in practice he takes his time. He drags his feet. Right? So we can't drag our feet. We, those of us who are already David, need to try to accelerate the transition towards Shlomo.